Five, four, three, two, one. Hello, and welcome to Life in the Foam, the post-centralized media podcast where people are either swimming through the vast, uncharted seas of myriad media or coasting in the direction of whatever information comes their way. I'm extremely fortunate to have spent the past Thursday speaking with writer, musician, and storyteller Thom Stark. In the 1990s, Thom was living in the San Francisco Bay Area, working as a tech journalist covering computer networking technology. On his website, starkrealities.com, you can find almost 100 of his articles chronicling the time span of 1995 through to 2002, written for publications like Land Times Magazine, Internetworks Magazine, IBM's Developer Works, and even the legendary Boardwatch Magazine, which had started back in 1985 to cover the then new world of dial-up bulletin board systems. Thom's articles on starkrealities.com, again, are a treasure trove of first-hand experience examining and communicating many facets, human and machinic, about the world being created by digital media as it was happening. They are a fantastical educational resource, both historical and technical. You're going to learn a lot going through his stuff. As soon as we linked up, the conversation got going. So, just like my premiere episode, let's jump right into a conversation in progress with tech writer Thom Stark.
When we got our first dog, we were living in Mariposa County, California. I don't know if you know it. It's the county that the majority of Yosemite Valley is in. And as such, it's got a lot of, wild areas. And in fact, we lived about, 10 miles outside of Mariposa Township. About a mile and a half down what I like to describe as a dirt road with delusions of gravel. And about a week and a half after we moved into our brand spanking new to us double wide, I'm standing in the living room decompressing after pulling an all-nighter to write one of those columns. And looking out the front window, I see stalking across our front meadow a mountain lion.
Oh, God. Welcome to the country.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, man.
So, I did what any animal savvy person would do, which is I walked out onto the deck and looked down at him from my height advantage of about 12 feet and said, "Good morning, Mr. Mountain Lion, and how are you today?" And, well, the thing is, you got to understand, ambushed predators tend to be cowards. They are not interested in a fight. They are interested in blindsiding their prey. So here I am, I'm wearing an ankle-length black bathrobe, so he probably thought I was a bear of some kind. And I clearly knew he was there, and it was obvious from my tone of voice that I wasn't afraid. Add that to me having the high ground, and he did exactly what I knew he'd do, which was to take off into the woods like a shot.
Right.
But the thing is...
you had to know all that. I mean, I'm not sure if I...
Well...
It's rather counter-instinctual, maybe.
Yeah, it might be counter-instinctual, but I have, kind of a unusual educational history. I am almost entirely an autodidact. And as such, my search for knowledge has always been pretty broad. And in fact, I basically learned how to read all at once over a period of about 6 weeks. And I was on temporary hiatus from first grade. And that actually takes me to a subject that I would like to discuss with you, because I think it is very cogent to your thesis. I was lucky enough to, if you want to count it as luck, to have been born extremely nearsighted. And I was so good at coping with it that nobody realized that, not even me. So, they send me off to first grade with high expectations, and I am instantly bored to death because I can't see a thing the teacher is chalking on the blackboard, not even from the front row. So it's all gobbledygook to me. And I became a disruptive presence because I was, well, bored. And my parents got called in to a conference with the principal and the teacher, who told them, look, your son, there's too much of a disruption in the class. He has not learned the alphabet. He's not grasping the reading stuff. And the teacher's class has too many students in it for her to give him the individual attention he so clearly needs. So take him out of school, try and teach him the alphabet and, the easy stuff for reading. And if he can make it through our primer, which was the Dick and Jane series.
Oh.
I don't know if you're familiar.
Picture book.
Well, no, it's actually a tool of the devil. I'll get into that. Not that I believe in devils, but it's handy shorthand. So my mom, who was not subject to the public education cult of whole word reading, decided to teach me using a combination of phonics and phonemics plus vocabulary drills. And when she realized, like day one, that I had actually negative interest in the doings of Dick, Jane, Sally, and their assorted chatels, she quite wisely pitched that book into the corner and taught me to read out of Dr. Seuss. So the beauty of that is that right off the bat, for a little kid, reading is a blast.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you get to grasp the words that accompany those wonderful, whimsical pictures and what have you. And there's an actual story, which was one of the things I hated about Dick and Jane, and I know generations have, because there was never an actual story. Nothing ever happened in Dick and Jane books. See Dick run. Run, Dick, run. Run, run, run. Because it's all about drilling new on the vocabulary. And the problem with whole word approaches to teaching is that, unlike the phonics and phonemics approach, they don't teach you to read atomically. They don't teach you about syllables. Okay, they don't teach you about phonemes, the sound units that make up the language, and how they aggregate into other words, and how many multisyllabic words are actually composed of smaller words with like explainers and add-ons to them that further refine the definition. Instead, with whole language, America's school kids have, this has been going on since the 1930s, been introduced to reading as a chore. It's something you have to do. And it is presented to them in a way that makes it as insufferably boring and stultifying as it's possible to imagine it can be. You're forced to drill on these word lists where you're not taught to recognize the syllables and how they go together. You're taught each word as a chunk, independent from everything else. And so you're basically having to memorize shapes. Okay? And then to drill on that stuff, they give you crap like Dick and Jane, where it's just, there is no entertainment value in those books at all. And it's just, they keep pounding tiny additions into you by repetition. I can't think of a a better strategy for discouraging kids from reading. And I think that's been at the heart of many of the problems that, well, our disconnected electorate deals with, because they don't read. Okay, they don't. Maybe conspiracy sites, but instead
stories that are captivating enough. When you put it that way.
Well, mostly. I mean, are you a person of Facebook?
Oh yeah, yep. I've got my fair share of broad point of views on the sort of memes people post around, to put it succinctly.
Right, but the thing is that what they're posting is not original content. It's not content that requires them to engage in the slightest amount of thought. They're posting these mimetic, digital posters, kind of counter-inspirational posters, and, propaganda screeds, and basically other people's content. It's a very passive approach. And I think a lot of that is because they never learned to love to read, so they never learned to love to learn.
Right.
Because I mean, it used to be back in the old days when we rode our dinosaurs to school, uphill both directions. The notion was that you wanted an informed electorate. But what we've got today is an electorate where campaigns are conducted by bumper sticker and slogan.
Absolutely.
There's no substance to it. And so it's all about emotion. Well,
yes, exactly.
Yeah, emotion is all very well and good, but we are the animal that uses language. We are the animal that understands our culture. Our civilization has grown to understand the importance of institutional memory in the form of things like, books.
Right.
Books. How about that? And you've just seen an enormous fall off in people who read and who learn for pleasure. Now, it's not that there aren't a significant number of readers out there. There are. And what they choose to read, for the most part, are romances, mysteries, and science fiction. Okay. And as a person who's been a science fiction fan literally since he was 6 years old, the first science fiction book I read was in, I think it was early December, like the first week in December of, my first grade, first year. And it was Thom Swift Jr. in the Caves of Nuclear Fire.
Oh. Thom Swift Jr.
Yeah, well, but at that point, my ability to read had increased to the point where I'd moved on from Dr. Seuss to learning from the Reader's Digest, which is ideal for kids because the articles are short, they're focused, and they have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Okay, it's like, all right, and 2.5, 4 pages later, you're done. You can move on to the next one. So that kind of got me to Reader's Digest condensed books, and I'd read probably a dozen of them before a friend of the family told my mom, well, he might like this, and handed her this Thom Swift Jr. book. And man, I enjoyed that. I enjoyed that a lot because, okay, the hero was a teenager, but he was a kid. Okay, kids identify with that. And I was reading at like a 12th grade level already. So, the vocabulary wasn't any problem. We didn't have the internet. So my folks decided to buy the Funkin' Wagnalls Encyclopedia, which was available at the Base Exchange on the news rack. And you just buy a new volume every week as they came out.
Oh.
And so they did that, and I essentially read the thing cover to cover from the time they first started buying it to the beginning of my second grade year. So over the course of being the first 7 or 8 months of my seventh year was spent reading the encyclopedia.
Right.
And you learn a lot of stuff.
Broad, yes, certainly.
Yeah, exactly. You don't learn anything in depth, but you learn a bit, kind of a survey about just an incredible variety of things. And at that point, I wasn't really being very discriminating. I was just, shoveling those words into my eyes as fast as I could. And, well, I swiftly decided that, for instance, when reading about countries, I could safely ignore things like principal exports and imports.
Sure.
Because as a kid, what did I need to know those things for? And my intuition was that those things would change by the time I was an adult. And they did, of course, because resources become exhausted, countries develop, and new products are introduced, and hey, nani. I mean, back in those days, rare earth elements were essentially a nuisance because we didn't have the kind of neodymium-based magnets that are ubiquitous in tech products these days. Nobody had figured out that you could vastly increase the strength of persistent magnets by adding just a tinge of neodymium to the steel. Okay? So, other than for chemists, the principal use for rare earth elements, because they were a byproduct of refining uranium, was in those chemistry sets that they don't let you have anymore. I had one of the ones that opened up into 3 separate chunks. You could get them with up to 5 separate chunks. And among the many little interesting things in them were little vials of rare earth minerals.
Wow.
And that's what they were for.
Go nuts, kids.
Kids. So, moving on to your thesis and kind of my...
Yes, no, that was a wonderful opening. To exposit my own how I can relate. Absolutely. I mean, my mother grew up having learned the whole word approach to reading as part of some new Ontario curriculum in the 50s or 60s or what, and so she was resolved to teach us how to read herself using a phonics program, so I did all of that at home, right? Absolutely. We had an encyclopedia. I was reading a lot of, we had Dr. Seuss books too, right? Absolutely. I was a voracious reader. And that was all short-circuited for me when the first computer, a compact Contura 425C little 486 laptop my dad brought home sort of immediately captured all of my interest overnight. The book I read the most was probably the Microsoft MS-DOS 5 manual. And I would sit there and I would just sit there typing, going through all of the executable files in DOS one by one, seeing what they could do, reading the names of all the viruses that were listed in Microsoft antivirus that came packaged with DOS 6.2, right? Stuff like that, right? So,
you will be amused to hear that I started seriously getting into computers in 1986 when I went to work for an audiovisual rental services firm in the San Francisco Bay Area that also did a nice little bit of business renting out genuine IBM PCs.
Mm.
And my first day at work, one of the things my manager assigned me to do, like, okay, you got your coffee, go change out the mono graphics card for a an EGA
Mm.
16 color card.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, which involved not only performing surgery on a genuine IBM PC, but actually having to research and flip the appropriate dip switches on the motherboard
Oh,
itself.
the right IRQ setting or what have you.
Well, no, actually, this was for the video subsystem.
Oh,
You
okay.
had to physically switch it out of monochrome mode and into EGA mode before it could make use of the card.
Oh.
Yeah, we're talking ancient technology here.
Yeah.
Anyhow, so I quickly became interested in that. Now, it wasn't my first exposure to computers. It happened actually back in the 1970s when I paid a visit to a friend of mine who was a student at Cal at the time and is now a senior system architect for Google. And he took me up to the Lawrence Hall of Science and went down to the basement where they had like a PDP-6
Oh, boy.
where he tried to teach me how to play the original ASCII Star Trek on it. And I couldn't figure out what the hell was going on because we're talking no CRT. This is a line printer for a display. And of course, I didn't know the rules to the game, which he did. So he swiftly mopped the floor with me, and I was left going, "What just happened?"
Wow.
And then actually, a couple months later, the Radio Shack store on Shattuck got its first TRS-80 with an actual tape drive.
Mm-hmm.
And the manager was a friend of mine, and so he allowed me to hang out for hours in Radio Shack playing with that. I discovered that the iteration of Lunar Lander that had come on the tapes with it was pretty stringent. I brought my Lunar Lander to within literally a thousandth of a meter, 1 millimeter above the surface at zero lateral drift and zero velocity. And it said it crashed.
Some great precision there. Still, you're no astronaut. No.
You have to arrive at ground level at zero velocity in any direction. But, that was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And then in June of 1980, my wife and I returned to California, and that same friend introduced me to what was then known as the ARPANET.
Yep.
Because it had not yet become the internet. The great switch over to IP only hadn't happened yet. There are all kinds of protocols flying across the wire. But at that point, you couldn't even get a login to the internet unless you were a computer science student at one of the schools on the backbone, or you were working for usually a defense contractor who was given access to it.
Mm-hmm.
And he happened to have, he was working at that point, and he had a WISE monochrome terminal on his living room table, the table we gamed on, that was hooked via a 56K leased line
Oh.
to his employer, which then allowed him onto the internet. And because I happened to be broke that day, when the rest of the guys in my gaming circle went off to eat at North China restaurant, I stayed behind and played rogue.
No.
Anyhow, so I've had a lot of exposure to
Sure.
computers for a very long time, but I started actually wrenching on them in '86.
Mm-hmm.
The day that the Challenger exploded and killed everybody aboard. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, first day at work, I'm trying to impress the boss with my being conscientious. So I took a TV that had been out on rental and hooked it up to a VCR and, tested it to make sure that everything was still functioning on it. And because we did occasionally rent them out for people who were like hosting football parties or something, I decided to be thorough and hooked a pair of rabbit ears up to it, flipped it onto ABC, and the first thing that came up was a voiceover and some videos saying, we're just receiving this unedited video from Cape Canaveral, and we're not sure what we're looking at. And I watched it one time through and then got up and went up to the front of the store and told the manager, Dan, you're probably going to want to take a look at this. The space shuttle just blew up and killed everybody aboard. Because it was obvious.
Yeah, right. Wow.
Again, science fiction fan from the age of 6.
Yeah. Rockets don't do that.
No, they don't. And nobody survives that because the space shuttle had no escape system.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
You blow the rocket off of it, it demonstrates the law of gravity.
Yeah, right. Well, that's a hell of a historical touchstone to have begun your own more professional career. Yeah, crying out loud. So
Right.
Listen, as far as I'm concerned, our podcast began about 20 minutes ago.
Okay.
So I'll tack a little introductory bit onto this, but let's press forward.
By all means.
So this is absolutely fantastic because as part of my project of the past few years, I've been drawing on the work of Marshall McLuhan, who was entirely obsessed with the meaning of words in an oral sense compared to literate silent reading, and the way perhaps your inner sense of thought, you were able to have a logical, cold detachment from the world thanks to the introduction of books en masse owing the Gutenberg press 500 years ago. So he's got this sort of technologically deterministic view of books, which was then undone by electric media, culminating in the television, leading to a post-literate sort of sensibility. So that's what he was freaking out about in the 60s and 70s, right?
And he was a visionary in more ways than one, but in particular to have apprehended that the very cool medium of television, you're familiar with this terminology, was going to wind up negatively impacting literacy rates because it's passive. You sit there and let it beam into your eyes and shout into your ears, and you're just you're a consumer. There's no interactive component to TV other than reaching for the remote. Okay. So whereas, as you know, McLuhan defined reading as a hot medium because it requires so much participation on the part of the reader. And it's not just the running your eyes across the line of words and figuring out what they mean, but the visualization process that as a reader, it requires you to go through to grasp what's being communicated. You know, you have to you have to understand what the writer is trying to evoke in you, and let that happen. And so it's really a participatory medium where you are bringing to it not only the active work of reading, which is much more engaging than just sitting and watching stuff, but also the imagination component, the part where it's up to you to visualize what the writer is describing, because he can describe it,
Yeah.
but he can't paint the picture for you. You do that.
Yeah, let me dig into that a little bit deeper. You've got how-to books that tell you how to build a house. You're a new American settler in the colonies, and you need to learn a whole bunch of stuff fast. How-to books. There's not a lot of imagination there. It's, chop a tree, build a log cabin, don't die in the wintertime. Here's how to live, right? And then the participation of reading a fictional story written by a true poet who can use words to paint a picture in your mind. That's extremely involving.
Oh yeah.
In a sense that early low-resolution television where the special effects are garbage are involving, but television has become heated up with, like, say, Game of Thrones or these other high-definition portrayals, or maybe where they give it all to you in high resolution and you don't have to imagine, right? You don't have to turn crappy Doctor Who sets into something believable. When you're watching modern television, which has become more full high definition, right? So,
Oh yeah.
right, so it's like you have to look at the mediums and then the arcs of how the mediums changed. The reason that you and I are talking is because you have been a trade writer in computer networking. For the better part of the 90s, you were at several magazines as a professional writer, going to trade shows, looking at how computers as a medium basically moved from something that required a whole bunch of technical knowledge and participation and understanding, and to get online has become easier and easier and easier to use, and the interface has become so hidden and obscure behind the easy-to-use phones everyone uses today that I feel like it's my suspicion, and I think you share the suspicion, that we're losing mass cultural knowledge about even what the substance of our electronic world is made of today.
Well, again, I think the problem is deeper than that, and I do very much believe that it begins with the public education establishment's cult of whole language reading. Because right from the get, it predisposes the vast majority of Americans, at least, to view reading as a chore, something to be avoided unless absolutely necessary. And so they don't read. Now, if you don't read, it's much harder to learn stuff, and nearly impossible to learn stuff on your own. I took a look at the lecture that you put up on YouTube, and you kind of are approaching that issue a number of times in it. But for me, it's really a central issue, because perhaps unlike you, I've always been a user advocate. I started really getting into computers back in the BBS era, when we were all elite, and civilians didn't have any idea that was even going on. Their idea of computers was Matthew Broderick and war games.
War games, yeah. There's a great book, Out of the Inner Circle by Bill Landreth, that was ghostwritten with Howard Rheingold. 1985, and he's one of the first hackers who was busted by the FBI for just jumping from system to system, and so he wrote this book, and he goes from phone freak culture all the way through to I guess early 80s hacking culture, and his number one complaint is, as soon as that stupid movie War Games came out, it was basically the precursor to Eternal September, and that all these noobs suddenly flooded all the hacking BBSs wanting to be like Matthew Broderick or whatever.
Right, right. But, again, to be like Matthew Broderick rather than to aspire to be like Matthew Broderick's character, you have to study.
Mm.
You have to learn stuff. And it's like not necessarily easy stuff to learn. I mean, you'll be amused to learn that at one point in the late 80s, I decided to do a roll your own community college course where the final exam was going to be for me to put together a list of all the DOS commands by version and what all their switches were, all their arguments, and a slug line defining them. And that, well, the attempt to do that taught me the importance of backups.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Berkeley Community College is in a building that's could charitably be described as falling apart. And one of the problems with it is that it has constant electrical problems. So I'm sitting there with the DOS manual open and writing this document. And I was working on it for like an hour and a half on a computer in their lab, and then the power went out. Not only hadn't I saved recently, I hadn't saved at all. I didn't even have a file name on the disk for it.
Mm-hmm.
So an hour and a half of work just went poof. And I said to myself, well, there's an object lesson. I'll never do that again.
Yes.
Then the power came back up, and I started back in on it. And 40 minutes later, the power failed again, and damned if I hadn't done exactly the same thing. And that cured me of that. I've never made that mistake again.
Yes. I've dropped. I spent 6 months building a model in Cinema 4D of the original Enterprise from classic Star Trek, and I dropped my hard drive one time. This is about, I was in grade 11, and it just went like floor chunk. I picked it up, it was ticking like crazy. Everything was lost. It destroyed me, right? One thing that I mentioned in the paper that my MEA presentation is based on is that the volatility of RAM is something that, or the volatility of digital data is something that you experience when you suffer a radical, catastrophic data loss, and you learn something about the material nature of the medium, of the, cyberspace simulatory medium, that as it becomes more and more reliable, as things get backed up for you, like say Apple Cloud saves all your stuff, and Facebook, right, as people take for granted that they're never going to print off the photographs that they took on Facebook or Instagram. They're not going to paste them into a paper book and stick them in a fire-safe vault somewhere, right? Nope. Everyone's life is... And also, furthermore, the more computers become reliable, the less opportunities they are going to have to learn these object lessons in the nature of the medium, right? So we're growing out of touch with the constructed nature of the world in that way. So in some ways, data loss is something people should go through.
Unfortunately, I agree with you. It's painful, as you and I both know.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the most important life lessons are, and there's no getting around that. Failure is always an option, and when it occurs, a wise person doesn't attempt to minimize it or excuse it. They try to learn from it because it's an amazing teacher. I don't ever want to do that again. It's amazing motivation to think things through and use your head for something other than a place to store your hat.
Yeah.
So the thing that I set out to say probably 15 minutes ago or more is that I've always been an advocate for end users. And I, unlike you perhaps, don't believe that they necessarily need to understand what's going on at a hardware level or even, you know, at an OS level
Hmm.
any more than in order to successfully drive in a car, you need to understand how internal combustion engines work or what a transmission does or, be
Hmm.
able to tune or repair your vehicle. There are people who are into that you can pay to do that.
Yes,
And
growing up, my
most
dad
people want to.
My dad, well, yes, we did not have it in the budget for me growing up for things like auto repair or home renovation. So my dad's very much the handyman who advocates not even bothering getting taken for granted by a mechanic. Fix it yourself, go learn it yourself. Right? He built an addition to our house. He spent 6 months in the library learning all the construction codes so that it would pass an inspection for him to be allowed to do this sort of thing. He fixed cars and sold them on our front lawn for spare cash. Right? So yes, I'm from this mentality that you do have to understand how the world works if you're going to avoid having to pay through the nose for expertise which are out of
Well,
the budget,
but
right?
again, what you have to understand is that on a professional level, um, my experience as a geek was all in the business community.
Mm.
My last salaried position was as a senior research analyst for Wells Fargo Bank. So the users I start out meaning here
Hmm.
are employees.
Hmm.
Just want to do their damn job.
Yeah. Yep.
You don't want to have to go bare knuckles with a printer driver. Okay.
Yeah.
They don't want to have to learn essential DOS commands to do data entry and
Hmm. Yes.
run analyses, spreadsheet analyses or do database queries. They just want to do their damn job.
The computer for them
And
has an application to
yeah,
their primary goal. It's a tool
right,
which they make use of. And I mean, that tool
right.
exists wholly in the simulatory high level cyberspace of end user products. What's interesting is you interviewed Mark Andreessen, one of the founders of Netscape, in 1995, when Netscape was like the biggest thing ever, and it seemed to define technological progress and the ability to capitalize on the internet, more
Mhm.
or less. Everyone was using Netscape when the world was exploding onto the World Wide Web in 1995 with the final end of all the no commercial activity on the internet. Like, that's basically the middle of the 90s. Suddenly became okay for companies to hawk their wares en masse online as the
Well,
old
well,
structure of hmm?
that's when the NSF net backbone was shut down
Hmm.
because commercial carriers, phone companies, basically,
Hmm.
uh, had provided um, de facto backbone services for the internet community, and it
The
really
oh, hello. Hopefully he'll come back soon. Oh, all right. We're back in business.
technology ain't it wonderful?
Oh, isn't it? Oh, so sorry. You were just starting to describe how the publicly
Oh,
funded National Science Foundation's internet backbone just became replaced by the growth of commercial ones from the big telephone service providers.
right. I mean, when people talk about Al Gore inventing the internet, he of course did nothing of the sort, but he was the uh, the principal Senate sponsor of legislation that um, funded the NSF net backbone in its early days. And so, in that sense, he enabled the development of the internet as we've come to know it. But, yeah, um, a techie ain't. Anyhow, yeah, when the NSF net was closed down because it just wasn't necessary anymore, I go to the expense. Um, that eliminated the rule that had gone with it of no commercial speech. And the reason that there was a no commercial speech rule in the early internet was that basically all the transcontinental traffic flowed over the NSFNet backbone, which, by the way, was a 64K link.
Oh, really? Is that all?
Yes. Yes. Again, we're talking about the days of the internet when almost everything was textual. Okay, so messages just don't require, text messages just don't, email postings to Usenet, what have you, just don't require that much bandwidth. But, as it became more and more of a thing and more companies created internet presences. The early ones were defense contractors, but then the computer makers started getting into it. And, I was doing a lot of Novell support when I got my first internet account of my own in late 1992. And one of the things I discovered right off the bat was that Novell had a substantial repository available on the internet for all of their drivers and patches and product alert bulletins and all the stuff that up until then it was necessary to access via a service called CompuServe. Okay, and I don't know if you ever had the displeasure, but CompuServe was just an incredibly awkward and user-unfriendly interface to try and get anything accomplished with. And it was constantly dropping connections because, everything was happening on their servers. And like business people everywhere, Dow Jones, which owned CompuServe, wasn't putting any more money into upgrading the infrastructure than they absolutely had to.
Right, of course.
So it was hair pulling. And then I got my Netcom account and found that, hey, Novell's there. And I started getting all my patches that way, which just made things a whole heck of a lot more pleasant from my standpoint as a, at that point, independent consultant.
Certainly.
Yeah.
So you were empowered as an end user to escape the walled garden of CompuServe or other people who were stuck in, say, AOL's walled garden, to use the common metaphor today that you see on computer forums, a walled garden, like the Apple ecosystem. As long as you do everything on your Mac the way Apple gives you iCloud and Apple gives you FaceTime, and you just stick to their little private, gilded cage of services, then you're going to be fine under the auspices of this one corporation who take care of you. And I suppose Apple takes care of their customers a lot better than CompuServe ever did theirs.
Go ahead, say it again.
As long as they pay through the nose for it, that is.
Right. Right. I mean, this was back, quite a lot of inflation ago. And CompuServe was $35 a month. Yeah. And, in 1992, that was, actual money. You could still buy a quarter ounce of weed for that money.
Man, you really got to sort your priorities. Yes.
Tough juggling act. But, beyond that, I mean, there was this piece of software, because what we saw really basically starting in late 1995 was a profound and fundamental change in the default access method for internet users. Prior to then, the way you used the internet was that you dialed in to an ISP who would give you a virtual terminal session
Mm-hmm.
to use. And so you're taking your PC and making it pretend that it's a dumb terminal.
Yeah.
And everything is textual. You got to know at least some basic Unix commands just to get around.
Mm-hmm.
And, everybody was happy until NCSA Mosaic was released. Now, the web had already kind of exploded in the high energy particle physics community because that's where it was invented at CERN.
Mm-hmm.
And, naturally, that was the first kind of interest group that took much heed of it. And that swiftly broadened out to computer science departments, and we were off to the races.
It's interesting how it started on such an esoteric platform as the Steve Jobs' Next Cube, such that the web could start off as this domain of you had to afford a computer made of magnesium to to be able to get on the web at the very start, right?
But again, keep in mind that the first web server and client were developed on was not the personal property of the man who developed it. It belonged to CERN.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't have to buy that computer.
Right.
Has money to burn.
Right. Sure. In many ways.
That same friend who's now a senior Google architect in the, I'm going to say, early 2000s, was hired by the European Supercomputer Initiative to help head up its OS development team. And that project went nowhere. They spent $38 billion and shut it down as something that was never going to work.
Yeah, well, I suppose that's the nature of all these research projects, like the ones, where there is no need to, I'm thinking of Xerox PARC specifically, because that's what I've read the most into, but when the researchers aren't under pressure to deliver some profitable thing, but rather to explore the possibilities in their own little lab off to the side, those opportunities are rare, but I guess these incubators are... can sometimes deliver.
This was a multinational government consortium of EU governments based on the border between France and Switzerland, where they were going to attempt to build a brand new machine, a massively parallel processing supercomputer.
Mm-hmm.
But, to get there efficiently with the least waste motion, you have to know where you're trying to go. Okay? If you're not sure where you're trying to go, you wind up exploring a lot of dead ends. So the supercomputer consortium management, none of whom was a computer guy. Because managers almost across the board are technologically incompetent. Their job is to manage, which is not coding. It's not developing hardware. Okay. So first thing they did, because, it's a big project, it's the first thing we're going to want to do, is they ran out and they recruited a whole bunch of high-powered engineering talent. Well, they, of course, were unwilling to just sit around sipping coffee. So they started into work designing the machine, the bus that would shuffle data around, the actual CPUs, because they were going to build their own CPUs, and all of that stuff. The OS team wasn't hired until the engineering staff was done.
Oh.
Yeah. And you see the problem.
Yeah. What
What
this?
you really want to do is have the people who are designing this thing start by saying, well, what are we trying to accomplish here?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then take the path that gets you there most effectively, which has got to be, in this case, beginning with the operating system. How is the operating system going to work to make this thing the whiz bang we need it to be?
Yeah, yeah. The kernel
You
has to fit
start,
the hardware.
yeah, if you start with the hardware, you're already putting handcuffs on your OS team because, you know, it's this is what you have to work with.
Yeah. Well, there.
Yeah, but wait, we wanted to make this really good.
It seems to me the epitome of the proper approach here then would be the Dynabook, by Alan Kay when he designed basically the iPad with a keyboard in 1971. He made this little cardboard mock-up model of this little computer kids could use to do stuff with, and that guided the development of the Alto and the development of the graphic windowed user interface, and culminate right. It was like a baton almost, this dream, which ended up getting taken by Steve Jobs more or less and finished
Well,
there as in terms of an end user product.
yeah, I mean, basically, Jobs stole Xerox's intellectual property.
Mm-hmm.
Straight up, there's no candy coating. But he didn't do it until it became clear to him that Xerox was dealing with him in bad faith, and they were trying to pick his brain for ideas to use for their own products and had no intention of actually working with him
Oh.
on a consumer device. And you have to keep in mind, the geniuses at Xerox decided that this marvelous microcomputer that their wizards had developed needed to be boutique priced. So the original Alto, as envisioned as a commercial product, would start at $30,000, and this is in the late 70s, and go up from there as you added optional bits to it.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about what I believe they also had 16K of RAM.
Something like that. Probably just to handle the bitmap screen. They had to, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it was developed from the ground up as a networked computer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
It had no local storage. It was going to use, hard files, as they were called, on a central server, and just be a client machine that handled, I/O for end users. It was a pretty clever piece of mechanism, and the main thing was the GUI. That was the thing that Jobs stole.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's an idea. Okay? And he just kind of, to use Robert Heinlein's famous phrase, filed the serial numbers off it and claimed it for Apple. Since the Alto was a dead product by the time that the Mac came out, Xerox didn't sue him over it.
So there you go. That's perfect because that motion was recapitulated in the movement from Telnet interface to the web browser.
Yep.
And Mark Anderson of Netscape was
Andreessen.
Andreessen. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a Scandinavian name.
By 1998, you attended the first open source software summit, and the big announcement of that year was that Netscape was going open source because Microsoft's free Internet Explorer they are giving away and actually integrating into the active desktop technology of Windows 98 utterly destroyed the market for buying a web browser. I mean, so in a matter of just a few years, the web browser market as the thing that made billionaires was immediately kicked out from underneath of Netscape and all the rest.
Let's keep in mind that Netscape never charged for its browser. If you wanted support, corporate clients could buy it for $35 a seat, and Netscape would provide them with tech support. But the browser itself was always free, which I thought was fine. But again, people are lazy, and the vast majority of computer users are largely technologically illiterate. And so you buy your new Windows 98 computer, and it comes with Internet Explorer already built into it. Why would I bother to download and install another browser? Yeah, it's free, but why would I do that? Particularly because there's all these websites out there that don't render properly in it.
Yeah.
And they didn't render properly because Microsoft was making use of its embrace and extend philosophy, which geeks refer to as engulf and consume.
Same old Microsoft. They love Linux now, by the way, haven't you heard? But
no. I have Windows 10. Although here we're on my phone. So.
Fair enough. So just one point. I suppose when you say Netscape is free, you're talking about people who can telnet onto some FTP or browse to some FTP server and download the binary from a server. But if you're standing in a store, and if you're standing in some computer retailer talking to the nice guy who's selling you a $2,000 computer, he's probably going to drop a $49 box with Netscape Communicator in it into your hand as an add-on tack, right? So it's free for people who knew. So Netscape made a ton of money from people who walk into the store and want the nice salesman to help them put the perfect package together for their kid to jump on the information superhighway.
Right, and Netscape gets a portion of that sale, and the store gets a portion of that sale, and the salesman gets a little hit too. Everybody wins except the poor consumer who doesn't know any better. I mean,
yeah.
I have to tell you, in all of the tsunami of just horrible news and trends that I believe are pernicious. I was greatly encouraged earlier this week when the Business Roundtable of America announced that it was changing its officially recommended practices for managers to de-emphasize shareholder profits at the expense of anything else, and instead was recommending that companies be managed with a balance of priorities, with shareholder profits being just one piece of the puzzle. And man, is that an overdue correction. And of course, there was immediate blowback because, America, I don't know about other countries, but in America, MBA schools have, for years, erroneously taught their students that they have a legal obligation to maximize profits for shareholders. They don't.
Right.
There's a Supreme Court decision that makes it really, really explicitly clear that there is no legal obligation for a Let me see if I can find this. Okay. Yeah, okay. I got it at Cornell Law. And if
Okay.
you want, I will send the link to you in email.
Certainly, I'll put that in the description and whatnot. Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure. That's
because,
fantastic. That's interesting news. Certainly.
yeah, well, because there has never been a requirement in law that a company be managed for the benefit of its shareholders. If it's managed in such a way that it is to their active disadvantage, that's another thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I have always thought that that was just a completely bogus philosophy and one that is to the disadvantage of society as a whole.
Oh, absolutely. It's sociopathic. Straight out. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
straight up. The thing being, with the rise to dominance of the Chicago school, you've got all these libertarians with a capital L who read Atlas Shrugged when they were teenagers and never got over it.
Right.
I found it really icky when I was a teenager. But part of that is because it's so absolutely badly written. Well, I mean, the major characters have this habit about every 15 pages or so of making these portentous speeches at one another that just go on for page after page. And it's like, sweetie, people don't actually talk that way, Okay, when Rourke is talking to Dagny, here they are, lovers, and he's giving her this, speech from the mountaintop.
Mm-hmm.
No, I'm sorry.
It's okay. Yeah.
Anyhow, there's
That's
an
cool.
awful lot of people in Silicon Valley and elsewhere who just took that as gospel,
I've got a superficial appreciation of Randian ideas. But yeah, it's extremely utilitarian in that self-serving, self-aggrandizing regard. It's certainly.
I mean, there's actually a philosophical school of thought called utilitarianism.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you're familiar.
Something Bentham. So no, but
yeah. Well, utilitarianism.
Yeah. I'm not sure how objectivism especially overlaps or lines up, but doesn't.
Objectivism is simply an excuse for greed that was authored by a woman who was just utterly traumatized by the change in her family circumstances that the Russian Revolution wrought. She was the daughter of a successful businessman, a member of the bourgeoisie, and of course, as a member of the bourgeoisie, he was a class traitor to the Bolsheviks.
Yeah.
So they confiscated his business. They confiscated their house. They crammed the entire family into a 2-room apartment. And she was miserably unhappy. But she was also miserably unhappy because her father was this cold, domineering, forbidding figure who, never showed affection to any member of his family.
Mm-hmm.
And her mother disapproved of her and told her she was a disappointment on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the psychological state of the young woman who borrowed enough money to move to America, found herself in Hollywood, and immediately acquired a job as a scriptwriter.
Oh, that's an interesting biographical tidbit that I hadn't known.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Right straight into the creating narratives. I'm going to step back from the immediate subject of this conversation, but just to comment on there's just in a more broad historical sense, so much of conversation today, this notwithstanding, which is very interesting conversation on libertarianism and Ayn Rand, but the ability for people to psychoanalyze other people is so rampant online in the content of discussion that I think one reason that I retreat into the technical nature of the world is just to escape the endless storytelling that our conversations have today about trying to psychoanalyze and second guess the motivations and the secret compulsions of everyone with whom we share a political or other disagreement with, so as to disabuse ourselves with tackling the substance of their argument. And
Now, you'll have to grant me a minor indulgence.
Of course.
I started out to become a psychiatrist.
Mm.
And in the 1970s, I went fairly aggressively towards that goal. And so as a sophomore, I began taking senior level psychology courses, including abnormal psych, which I had to get a waiver to get into.
Oh.
And that cured me of wanting to be a psychiatrist.
Oh, God.
Well,
Wow.
because I realized very early on that every one of my classmates in that class, all of whom were also aimed at becoming either professional psychiatrists or professional psychologists, depending on their tolerance for medical school, were badly fucked up human beings. Okay? There were a couple of obvious malignant narcissists in there. There was all kinds of, just blatantly neurotic behavior and physical mannerisms, and you can tell when a person is not hooked up right. And I realized, oh God, if I become a psychiatrist, these people are going to be my professional peers, and I have to interact with them at conferences and professional seminars and what have you.
Oh, my God.
I don't like any of these people.
You'd want to join a club that had them as members.
Exactly.
For crying out loud.
So I said, Thom, choose another path.
You are one of the most well-rounded individuals I've enjoyed interlocuting with. Perhaps for that, it's interesting you say that, because I just cracked open Alice Miller's The Drama of the Gifted Child. So she's she's a former psychoanalyst who was in the 80s repudiating psychoanalysis in terms of her own concept of the dynamics of it. And from the get-go, she basically is addressing the book to all of her comrades comrades is perhaps the poor choice of terms, her professional colleagues, in terms of, listen, you guys are all fucked up, as part of the implicit, nature of her book. So, yeah, wow. Sorry, I'd like to, unless you have some final words on this,
what I'd like to do is return to something I tried to get into to begin with.
Please.
But, you've probably noticed that my writing style as a columnist, as an essayist, is elliptical.
Mm-hmm.
I'll introduce a topic with a personal anecdote, and then I will appear to wander off into the weeds. But it always comes back to that topic at the end, and hopefully you've had fun on the journey. So that's a reflection of my personality. I digress. But what I set out to make a point about is that, to me, the problem is not so much that the ordinary run of person who uses the internet is dirt ignorant of the tech. In the same way that it doesn't bother me that the majority of the drivers on the road are dirt ignorant about internal combustion engines and braking system. Mm-hmm. Because you don't need to know that stuff to be a good driver.
Mm-hmm.
But you do need to pay attention to the road and know what the rules are, which results in me constantly being white-knuckled as I find myself surrounded by idiots who are paying more attention to their smartphones than they are to the task of driving.
Oh, huh.
Because
Uh-huh.
that's disconcerting and dangerous. Um, Anyhow, to me, the problem is not as much uh, a failure to understand the underpinnings of the technology that they're using to communicate over one form or another of
Mm-hmm.
social media.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And really, I think you were right. I think it was Facebook that coined that term. Um, but the problem is, well, there are several problems. The biggest problem, as far as I'm concerned, and I think you may agree here, is that what the vast majority of internet users today lack is context.
Mm-hmm.
They spend their online time in Facebook Messenger and Pokemon Go and stuff like that, and they don't realize that A, there's a world outside of that,
Mm-hmm.
and B, that in particular in the case of Facebook, um, the content um, that they are being presented with by default is there due to algorithms that were developed by Facebook specifically to and increase user engagement, which is a kind of a technical sounding, markety kind of locution that in fact means keeping people on Facebook regardless of what's required.
Mm-hmm.
And so what they get
Mm-hmm.
is um, these opinion or even interest silos that they get assigned to by that stupid algorithm. Where and there's been a lot of stuff about YouTube doing the same thing. I don't know. Yeah, you do. You're a Slashdot user,
Yeah, for
right?
almost 20 years now. Yep. That was
Okay.
my
So
precocious kid reading was Slashdot comments.
yeah. So you know exactly what I'm talking about. You get, you know, the social media platforms are trying to optimize your experience to keep you on their app
Yep.
by feeding you more of what their tracking of you tells them you are interested in.
Yes.
Okay. And so what you get is this greater and greater concentration of the same point of view, the same set of prejudices and opinions and um, I don't know, and
Oh yeah.
kind of
Oh,
intellectual
you're in your
slash political environment.
the echo
That
chamber.
Yeah, and
Mhm.
you're handcuffed to it by that fucking algorithm that says this is what we're going to feed you. We're going to keep feeding you this same stuff
Mhm.
because it keeps you on our platform.
Mhm.
Well,
Yeah, to
it's
to
it's a platform, of course, because they make APIs available to third-party developers who can build extensions and also use their backdoor stuff to data mine users' browsing habits and what have
and we
you.
see how where that's leading insofar as nudging, which is another buzzword that's 10 years young. The nudging of people's agencies through datalytics and yeah, and the sort of well, see, here we go. This gets me back to why I do emphasize computer literacy at the full stack level, is because in McLuhan terms, in order to step back and view the scene that you're in, you need an anti-environment to move into. And so it's the artist's job to create a lever far enough out in space for people to walk on and behold what they've been swimming in, unbeknownst. So people are swimming in this sea of social media, which is crafted for them from out of these algorithms, and it constitutes part of their being, who they are, what their beliefs are. It's part of their world, even though it's behind glass. It's a space that they move in and out of as freely as they walk down their stairs out their front door, right? When you said people have to realize there's a larger world out there, I'm sure you meant there's a larger world of the internet and of disagreeing or broader conversations they could get into. But also there's a world out their front door they could be out playing, soccer with someone or whatever, right? And so
walking their dog,
their dog, right? So for me, it's really interesting again to tie back to your work. You attended the first open source summit when Eric S. Raymond's The Cathedral and the Bazaar was causing shockwaves in the sense that businesses were finally realizing, hey, maybe giving away the source code to our applications for free can get us people to work on our project for free, can incentivize our business to work on the things that make us money while receiving customer loyalty from people who are happy to get our stuff for free, because software is free and you can't fight the pirates forever. So let's give away the software and build business models around all the other accompanying things. And as you know, I'm a Richard Stallman sort of more idealist sort of bent towards the reason for free software is not merely to help companies make money. It's to liberate users to enact their own agency and control their PC so their PC doesn't control them. And
and this is key. To understand people, you have to understand this. At least in this country, okay, I can't speak for other countries because I don't know them as intimately as I do this one. And I live in rural southern Ohio, okay? This is Republican country. This county voted 63% for John McCain over Barack Obama. That's how Republican this is. Mm-hmm. And, the vast majority of that is driven by evangelical Christians who are thick on the ground here. And, of course, they are the principal constituents of the Republican Party's base in this country, which is why the party is so afraid of Donald Trump, because the evangelicals have decided he's their man. And so you go up against him, you wind up retiring, as Bob Corker of Tennessee would be happy to testify. To me, the problem is greater than lacking the context of the technology. It is a lack of context altogether. Sadly, Americans as a breed are among the most incurious and clue-resistant people on the planet. They not only don't want to be educated, they will actively fight any attempt to educate them. They're not having any of it. Because, America's built on a series of myths. Okay, starting with that the Pilgrims emigrated to the New World to escape religious persecution in England. That's bullshit. The Puritans migrated to the New World in order to be left alone to discriminate against non-pilgrims. You got to understand that during the Protectorate, okay, the period of the Roundheads and the Cavaliers, the Lord High Protector was a pilgrim. He was a member of the same religious sect as the Pilgrims. After he died, there's a big civil war in England, and the monarchy was restored with a Catholic monarch. And all of the laws that he had passed that prescribed, anything but the state religion were undone by the new king and the parliament. And one of the artifacts of that was that the people who had been in charge of England were no longer able freely to scourge unbelievers and blasphemers, to put them in stocks or duck them to see whether they're witches or what have you. All that was outlawed under Charles II.
Mm-hmm.
No. Okay. And that made them very unhappy. They first migrated to Holland, where, to their horror, they found it was even more laissez-faire. The Dutch being famously tolerant. It was like, but wait, you're not listening to our message. No. We're conducting trade. So, coming back to England, oh man, the situation had deteriorated even further. People were calling them fanatics in the street. So, they decided to migrate to the New World, got themselves a land grant, and set out to set up a colony they could discriminate to their heart's content. And they did. Okay. So, it's just starting with that foundational myth. Okay. America has just been full of shit. We lie to ourselves about who we are, how we got here, and what we are when you scratch us down beneath the surface.
Uh-huh.
And that was really exacerbated by the Greatest Generation, because they found a hero in a fellow by the name of Marion Michael Morrison. And if that name is unfamiliar, you probably know him by his stage name, John Wayne.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yes.
And John Wayne, who, believe it or not, was afraid of horses. Hey. All right, Wagner, go ahead. Sorry, I'm having to let my dogs out. Okay, Wagner, go ahead. All right, buddy, come on. So, yeah, these are the guys here. This here is Wilson. Hey, Wilson, say hi to Clinton. Oh, stop it.
Wilson's just a...
Sorry.
Oh, hey.
I hit the power button.
There we go. You're back.
Okay.
I think...
You're going to do your thing? So, at any event, that John Wayne did more harm to the immigrant can think of, because the character he portrayed over and over again
rugged
was
individual,
a mythical American, and men of that generation just bought into that wholesale and retail. And can't get too much further out or I'll lose the connection. In the backyard. You got anything else to do, buddy? Huh? You got anything else to do? No, sweet boy. Okay. Let's go inside. Anyhow, sorry about this.
No, of course. It's fine.
Okay, buddy.
All right. Some very dense context. Oh.
Good one. All right. Sorry, we'll be done here in a second.
Oh, of course.
You are such a good puppy. Yes, you are. Okay, buddy, we're done.
Gives me time to think. Some very broad contexts that you're laying out there on the cultural myths, which is precisely the right term. When you were talking about how on social media or how people lack context at large, this is precisely what the end of literacy and the creation of the erection of our electronic environment. McLuhan would say that we will have to rely on the pattern recognition and mythical thinking to even try to think fast enough to make sense of anything. But this results in people who aren't grounded in being able to read the environment from having only contextless mythological thinking to suggest to them what's going on in the world indirectly. For an inability to you can't logically comprehend cause and effect, where we've in the behind the scenes rewired cause and effect to such a degree where algorithms can shape the environments people live in, and people are variously have we moved from a centralized television environment and cinema environment that presents centralized broadcast programming to you could let's use the term multicasting and narrowcasting.
Narrowcasting, I think, is probably the better term. Again, I'm a networking geek. Multicasting has a specific meaning,
which means to not redundantly send information down the pipe the way Pointcast was doing in 1997 when they reached a terabyte a day of bandwidth transfer.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And there's still provision in the IP code for multicasting, but you basically only see it in academic environments and research environments.
They just fatten the pipe so wide that everyone need throw caution to the wind when it comes to efficiency, which is, every level of bloat in the software stack, you can make the same charge, really.
I agree. But to kind of round off the point I've been trying to get around to making for a while now. Again, I think this all ties back to the pernicious influence of whole word approaches to beginning reading, because it creates an incredibly strong disincentive to read other than by requirement of higher authority. Okay? The whole notion of reading for pleasure goes out the door when you make reading a chore for little kids. In my case, I suspect maybe in yours as well, using the right primer source and approaching it from a phonics and phonemics standpoint. You start with the alphabet and then build up the bits to words, and then adding vocabulary lists as an adjunct to that.
Vocabulary lists. See, my mom was reticent to off the cuff give us a definition of a word. If I were to ask my mom, what does this word mean? She'd always go to the dictionary, go to the dictionary, right? Just no inferring the meaning of a word through context. Every time you come across the word you don't know, look it up. And I look up 5 words a day today, even. I've got a dictionary always at my fingertips, right? So that's just an additional...
And one of the things I did during my 7th year was to read, I'd say, almost 3/4 of the Webster's Collegiate Dictionary for fun. Mm-hmm. Because there's some words in there, okay?
Yeah.
There's all this stuff to learn. It was great. And that's the problem with the American public education system, is that it starts out by making the thing that is really the foundation of modern learning, reading, into a chore, something to be avoided unless you're forced to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That takes an awful lot of potential fun out of self-education. If reading is a chore, it's not something that you want to do. And that, plus, again, in this country, the never to be sufficiently condemned, no test left behind policies of the federal government
Mm-hmm.
beginning in the Bush years, those two between them have robbed the millennial generation, and even more so the post-millennial generation, who are just now creeping up towards adulthood, of context. You can't have cultural context unless you have a broad knowledge of the culture, and that definitely includes history, because if you don't know how you got here, it's as if you were plucked out of one world and plopped down in another one, completely free of context or history.
Yes.
I enjoy reading history. My area of specialization is the Greek and Roman classical historical period, and my special focus is on the life and campaigns of Alexander the Great. I'm no longer as current on literature as I was, but at one point, early on in the century,
you are the go-to.
Anything you wanted to know about Alexander the Great, I could tell you. I could tell you where to go to find the source for that statement, and probably get you within a couple pages. Because
it's a hell of a.
Well, I've been fascinated by his life since I read Volume 1 of W. Tarn's biography of him in the 4th grade.
That would do it. And it's a hell of a subject.
Yeah, well,
moving across the continent and what?
Yeah. Yes, and growing and changing as a leader as he went along. He started out being a Hellenic chauvinist, because the Hellenes were just chauvinistic as hell. The definition of barbarian, the true definition of barbarian, is one who does not speak Greek. That's it.
Yeah.
So they would refer to the Persians as barbarians, for instance, when they were actually very sophisticated, highly technologically advanced civilization at that time, who, among other things, had invented the concept of the Royal Road to allow them to send communications from one corner of their empire to the furthest one away in a week. Okay, and we're talking thousands of miles. And in fact, their dispatch rider system was borrowed wholesale by the Pony Express.
No need to reinvent the wheel there. Wow.
Right. But
wonderful.
They were barbarians.
They didn't.
If you only speak Greek, Persian speakers are just bar, 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 bar.
It's easy to understand. That's very fascinating. You immediately evoke the idea of a world that's larger than the one we have today, where the boundaries press on forever. Greeks as the center of a world without boundaries, because you live on the flat Earth anyway, right? Trying to grapple with these contexts of these trans-historical evolutions of cultures. It's always a fun experiment.
I enjoy it, and that's why I've been interested in it.
Yeah,
I don't think it's of a lot of practical value to most people, but the thing about
you got to go through
general knowledge,
you can't skip it. You got to go through it. I mean, I think
Yeah, well,
everyone should
you
appreciate
can't
it.
know what's going to be useful to you down the road.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and for me, the saddest aspect of what has happened to our culture in the age of social media platforms is the widespread belief on the part of millennials and post millennials in just in time knowledge. And for that, Wikipedia is an amazing resource. The problem is that while Wikipedia can often give you a good thumbnail, 10,000 foot view notion of a subject, it doesn't really provide you with depth. It often does not really provide you with context, particularly if you have trouble reading and don't like doing it. So you just skip around and get the good parts. Okay.
Yep.
You wind up with this, you know, the set of factlets that are divorced from context,
Mm-hmm.
historical context, societal context, ethical context,
Mm-hmm.
legal context, none of that stuff, really winds up communicating itself to the person who looks it up on Wikipedia and then thinks they know what they need to know about it and pass on.
Mm-hmm.
Because everything exists as part of everything else. Okay, that's what context is about.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is interrelated at some point or another. And the more you know about just stuff, anything, everything, the more you see those connections. And they don't see those connections.
Perception.
They can't.
Perception.
They don't have the
Mm-hmm.
background of knowledge to be able to understand those things. They were never exposed to them.
Let's bring this home, because what you're one problem, well, I won't say problem, one issue which arises with reading these facts without the sufficient experience to put them in their proper place in a larger context, and I mean, this context can grow from an embodied experience of living and growing up and having to gone through things, so as to have, the life story or the narrative of being a person having done all this stuff, to then be able to slot and read in the abstract information you're consuming while you're sitting on your ass, whether it's television or whether it's reading Wikipedia articles. You aren't building a coherent, integral identity or view which situates you in the world at large. Right? It might situate you inside of a tribe or inside of an ideology or an abstract system. And so McLuhan would talk about living in your head as being all about just the dialectics of logic that's divorced from, the practicalities of it, and the rhetoric of knowing what to say to convince someone else of something, but it's entirely through, the words and the rhetoric and the eloquence of your speech and having the snazzy memes and just the right, punchline. And so people...
Razzle dazzle.
Razzle dazzle, right? And people lack the grammar to read out of a text or out of the perceptual experience in the world just what's going on, and tether, to ground the abstract runaway thoughts in their head into an experience of, okay, when I'm thinking of this is what's actually going on, right? With so much lingo in today about opening your eyes or being red-pilled or needing to get in touch with reality for whatnot, people are being woke. Yeah, so we've got a million terms going all the way back to elevated consciousness cults in the 60s, or going back to even the Marxist idea of awakening from false consciousness. We've been living in there's all of this lingo it's just floating around about the urge to wake up to something real, right? So that's the threat that social media, has people living in a matrix. That's why I want to reground people in the material understanding of the media, of the modern day communications technology, no matter how complex it is, because it at least forces you to understand the physical relation of you in an embodied sense to all of the devices that you have, which are so small, yet also are more complex than, the infrastructure of the biggest city in the world, right? All the plumbing in Singapore is less complex than what fits inside of, this little box and what it's doing at 2 million, 2 billion, times a second, and just appreciating the scale of the world that we've built on the macroscopic and the microscopic seems important to returning to a sense of reality.
I can't disagree with that. Again, though, to me, the wider problem is that the society that is evolving seems hell-bent on devaluing knowing things in favor of feeling things. And again, this ties into what I view as some of the fundamental flaws in the American character. I mentioned earlier, it is my strong feeling that Americans are among the most incurious people on the planet. They don't want to know, and they're not going to let you tell them. Okay? That's why newspapers and magazines are in their death throes, because people don't read for pleasure or for information. Me, I've always enjoyed collecting facts that may or may not eventually have some utilitarian purpose for me. But it's just nice to learn these things and go, I didn't know that.
To survey something of the breadth of
and
knowledge.
Then at some time in the future, I mean, I'm a writer, so collecting trivia is actually a key skill for a writer, because you never know when some factoid is going to be exactly the hook you need to hang whatever you're currently writing on.
Or who knows?
I'll give you an example of my own work. When I was writing Mayday, the first volume of my novel, there was a scene, a chapter that I tried a couple of times to write and couldn't. It's the one, I don't know if you read the work. It's the one where the CEO of Lloyd's of London is really facing the destruction of the company that the worldwide insurance marketplace meltdown consequent to the nuclear bombing of Manhattan has engendered. Okay, it's going to crash on his watch, and there's nothing he can do about it. Nothing, because it's force majeure, events beyond his control. And originally, I had him standing on the roof of the Inside Out skyscraper in London's financial district, staring down at the alleyway and contemplating jumping. But that just seemed too easy. So I rethought it, and then while I was browsing one of the science sites that I like to look at, I came across a story about a group of researchers who had produced the most profound black ever by using a high-energy laser beam to do nanoscale etching of a sheet of iridium. And by properly etching the surface with this, micropulses, nanoscale texturing of it, they caused it to scatter light in such a way that it's even blacker than, say, Vanta Black. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Right.
Okay.
I think of Stanley Kubrick agonizing over what to build the monolith out of for 2001. I understand he would have liked to have known about that.
Right. So I went, okay, that works. So the hook I hang that scene on is a Newton's cradle, a little device with the balls that go clickety-clack, right? That was given to the CEO as a gift of appreciation from his board of directors, and it's like a one-off objet d'art whose frame is made of iridium that's been nano etched to be blacker than black, um, as a toy, and it's embedded with gemstones and what have you. He starts it going, and he spins around in his chair, and he looks across the street uh, at the Deutsche Bank building, while behind him on his desk, he's getting panicked email alerts and IMs showing up on the screen, and his silenced phone, all the lights are blinking. And he just doesn't want to deal with that because he's thinking about the crash that's coming, knowing he's going to lose his job. Lloyd's is going to go out of business. And so is every insurance company on earth, because the way reinsurance works, insurance companies buy each other's risk to spread it around. Okay, so if you're Lloyd's, you sell risk to other insurance companies and buy some of theirs, and it spreads the pain around if you have to pay off. But when Lower Manhattan is vaporized by a terrorist nuclear device that's set off on the 63rd floor of the Freedom Tower at noon on the 1st of May, 2020, well, all the insurance companies, because of their shared risk, are doomed. And he knows that. And so, looking out there, contemplating the wreck, he turns back around to see the Newton's cradle decelerating towards a stop, and thinks what a perfect metaphor it is for the global economy. Okay, so that's how profound. Knowing stuff actually becomes of use.
Yeah.
If you don't know stuff like that, if you're waiting on Wikipedia to give you the knowledge, you don't know to look for that knowledge there.
Yeah.
You lack the context in which that knowledge acquires particular value. And context has all but disappeared from the digital culture, as it were, because we have so, adversely conditioned young people not to read. We have stolen from them the little context we used to give them in grade school and secondary school, because all those history and civics classes, they got peeled out of there and thrown away so they could teach the tests for no test left behind.
Yeah.
Okay. And nowadays, colleges, universities, are coming more and more to market themselves to their students as glorified trade schools. When I was growing up, the purpose of going to college wasn't to receive a degree that you could wave around your people. You wanted to do that, but it was to learn how to learn. Because that's not something they typically teach you in primary and secondary school. To learn to do actual research, how to use a technical or academic library to follow the breadcrumbs to find out what's known about a given topic. Okay?
Yeah.
That doesn't happen anymore. They're teaching you to be a computer scientist. They're teaching you to be an English teacher. They're teaching you to be
what's going to get you a job to pay off your student loans? Because if you don't get a
exactly.
job that'll help you pay off your student loans, you are a sucker to even go to school.
Well,
that's the logic that's behind.
Yes, it is, and it's just utterly bankrupt, and it's a betrayal of the fundamental tenets of Western civilization, which include the notion that knowledge is a good thing in and of itself and worth pursuing. Learning to think skeptically not accepting what you're told at face value, but digging into it. Wait, where is this coming from? Who's saying this, and how much credibility do they have? And what is the evidence that this is so? And it is producing a society that is unmoored. Okay? There's no basis for the culture other than these fucking social network programs. And I'm sorry, that's not a culture.
No, you're right.
Except, in the sense of what you find in a Petri dish.
That's a metaphor that Neil Postman uses to great effect, because of course in a petri dish, what a culture grows suspended in a medium.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
We can. There's. I think our conversation has been absolutely fecund for closing on a constructive note here, because. Well, you see this old black and white IBM laptop behind me. I was using that every day as my distraction-free word processor, because it's just a 386 that I can run Microsoft Word 2.0 on. And I found some 3 floppy disk large version of Collins desktop dictionary that runs in 6 that I was running. So I had a dictionary app and I had a word processor. And it's the only thing you could do on this thing. I was spending 3 or 4 hours a day sorting out all the stuff when I was trying to put it together. And right now on my Linux computer, I've got that same 16-bit dictionary application running in Wine, and it is my go-to desktop dictionary actually, because it's instant and it's easy and it's offline. I think.
Yeah, I hear you.
It's like, why bother changing now, right?
Well, and what? I mean, other than the fact that you get more physical real estate, why bother to use a modern, high dot density, full color display to display text?
To display text, right. I mean, I learned when I was on the internet, I had dial-up until probably 2007, 2008, right? So it was all textual. And the web forms, they weren't threaded, and aside from /dot, they weren't sorted by karma systems. You weren't cherry-picking the most popular comments, and you weren't chasing down 6 blind avenues to some conversation that only lasts 3 or 4 threads deep. And I mean, I might have to translate that for some of our listeners, but the point is long-form discussion, which takes place over the course of days and weeks in one particular topic, is that was the bedrock of internet culture that I grew up in as a literate young man, and that's something which we don't have today in the ersatz algorithmically generated hall of mirrors changing social media cyberspace that young people are being thrown into, with where no one's going to read more than 3 or 4 sentences anyway.
I would fix that for you. Not thrown into, sucked into.
Absolutely. It's addictive before you know
the right metaphor is quicksand.
Oh, and the more you thrash, the deeper you get sucked in too. Now that you think about it.
Exactly, and it's gotten to the point where there's a number of people, and that number is growing, who can't imagine being deprived of their phone for any longer than it takes them to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
First thing they do when they wake up in the morning, they hit the alarm clock and reach for their phone.
Well, see, they're plugged into the matrix, and it's a painful thing to be ripped out of. It'll mess with your psyche, because wandering around in an embodied state, everyone used to walk around without a cell phone nowadays, and then now I feel strangely disconnected if I forget my phone at home and I'm walking down the street going, oh my god, there isn't even a payphone I could reach if I... What would happen to me, right? Anyway, the point being, thank you so much. I'd love your focus and your emphasis on proper literacy, done right, done early, and being able to have an ability to read instantiated at a level that makes reading easy and fun and something you do without thinking, which... It delves you in. It is fun.
It doesn't have to be easy as long as it's fun.
Yes.
That, making it challenging, that allows you to gamify the learning to read experience.
Right.
Your mom kept telling you, go look it up. Don't ask me. Look it up for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
That's gamifying reading,
Mm-hmm.
forcing you to take actions on your own behalf to increase your knowledge. It's not being shoved down your throat. You're devouring. Very different mindset. Very
Yes.
different mindset.
Absolutely.
And, I hate that has been lost. And unfortunately, as long as the public education system in the United States clings the whole word and straight up rejects phonics and phonemics, it's a cult. It started in the 1930s, and the whole word approach has been inculcated into primary and secondary school teachers as an universally acknowledged, unquestionable good. So they just line up for their little glasses of Kool-Aid and buy that, wholesale and retail, and so they don't bother to use phonics or phonemics to teach their beginning reader students. They teach them the alphabet, and then they teach them word lists, and they drill them on them by giving them primer materials that are designed to stultify them, to make their eyes cross and to make their minds wander to what's going on out there on the playground, because there's sure nothing fun happening here. And I think that is as crazy, backwards, upside down an educational philosophy as it's possible to imagine.
Well, here are you and I speaking, two voracious readers. So I wouldn't say it's lost, but it's been marginalized. Perhaps the literate are no longer constitutive of societal trends, but numbers are growing, not shrinking, I think, at this rate. Because when people finally realize that they're going insane in apathy of passive consumption of media, they basically got nowhere else to go but to go looking for answers, and reading. Right, so there's much history ahead for the readers, and I think this has been a fantastic conversation, Thom.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Absolutely. This is probably one of my best episodes so far. So I'd so much like to thank you for coming on, and I'd love to talk to you again sometime in the near future.
That'd be fine with me. And if it's on this topic or another one,
hey,
I'm happy.
I think whatever it is, this conversation has been auspicious towards where it may go. Thank you to everyone who's listened to this nearly 2-hour-long episode of Life in the Foam, the podcast about living in your own media environment once you've fallen out of the mainstream bubbles. You can find my website at concernednetizen.com. You'll be able to find lots of links to Thom's work here, his website, starkrealities.com. You can go read. I was going to say that you should write a book on the history of computer networking, but basically you already have. It just needs to be put together from your articles over the past 5 years, because the depth...
Well, you could look at it that way. History is important, kid. If you don't know where you've been, it's hard to see where you're going, and you'll never figure out how you got here.
Thank you.
Clinton, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I'm very glad to have met your acquaintance.
Likewise. Take care, everyone.
All right, buddy. See ya.
See ya.